a lot of that is obviously a byproduct of white supremacist or racist kind of assumptions that anything that's practiced by people of African descent that's not Christian or not easily recognizable or defined by a Western sensibility has to have some inferior or evil basis to it. Not the case. What we understand in reality is that these faith systems and many others, we can talk about more contemporary forms like Rastafari religion or religiosity in Jamaica, or Candomblé in Brazil, as just two more modern or recent examples, wherein people of African descent are not only taking up their own level of spirituality and belief systems, but then are also being wise about what they receive from pre-existing or established religious traditions and what they reject. So, for instance, excuse me, with religious systems like, or belief systems like Santeria and Voodoo, you actually have a situation where there may be an adoption in a formal sense of Catholic saints and certain Catholic rituals or sacraments, but they're being merged and being morphed with an embrace of traditional African deities or practices, most particularly taken from, I believe it's Yoruba systems, right? So the notion of Oshun or Ogun being brought in and now being represented and symbolized by, at least on the surface, by a Catholic saint, but really still having that core ancestral meaning that survived, over the many years and over the many miles of the Mill Passage or the distance from the original African experience back on the continent.
Okay, why do we see more African-based religions in the Caribbean as opposed to more? I don't want to say that they're complete assimilation, but in the United States, the religious practices of Black people, where you do have some incorporation of African elements, right? But they're more based in a westernized understanding of Christian views, right?
Well, I think in part this varies by. We have to be mindful of, as real estate people say, location, location, location. That in certain cases, where you landed or where you were enslaved mattered. So, for instance, in Latin America and the Caribbean, for instance, where white influence and presence was minimal at best, right? And I'll use specific examples here. For instance, in Brazil and in various parts of Latin America, there was a system of enslavement known as absentee landlordism, or a state in which there was a minimal European presence there, and so by that token, the Code Noir, or the slave codes, were somewhat more relaxed, which allowed for notions of Christian baptism, but then also allowed for the Africans who were there to also practice and celebrate their own spirituality in a fuller sense, without direct supervision or intervention by Westerners, the Spanish, the Portuguese, what have you. So then that's why, for instance, in a place like Brazil, especially in Salvador de Bahia, right, you can have some of the purest retentions of African culture and spirituality outside the continent, right? It also helped that, by and large, outside of Africa, the largest point of destination for enslaved Africans in the Western Hemisphere was Brazil. So just by sheer numbers and concentration, you're going to get a more robust retention of practices and culture there than, say, North America, where even though we speak of the institution of child slavery more more intensely, here actually we by the numbers had fewer enslaved Africans originally land in North America than elsewhere on the map. But the idea that just talking about it demographically is within the American South, right? The idea that at best, at the start of America's history, talking about you know, the 1700s, 1780s, you had a situation where the tipping point between the white population and the black population was more even then than it would be in, you know, by the time that slavery ended in 1865, right? That there was always a more intense scrutiny, both by law and by habit, where whites would constantly try to interrogate and investigate any gathering of black peoples with themselves. So for instance, even as we affectionately refer to and think about hush harbors, right, or brush harbors, depending on how you grew up understanding them, these were secret concealed gatherings of enslaved Africans and African Americans where they were able to work out their spirituality, get their religion, religious practices going. But even in those gatherings, they always had to be mindful or fearful of white supervision, white detection, white interruption of those gatherings.
So a larger white presence makes for more restraint and limitations on black people.
Well, I mean, by its definition, especially when it's attached to a form of enslavement that depends on a level of social control, because once, in every slave society, whether you're talking about the United States, you're talking about the various slave societies of the Caribbean, you're talking about the slave societies of Latin America, or you think about even historically and biblically in terms of Egypt and in the Bible, in the book of Exodus. Even though slavery is a historic phenomenon, there becomes an interesting kind of mindset amongst the enslaver when they start to see the enslaved folk outnumber them, right? And so there's a fear factor about anything, including religion or spirituality, that will bring this large and growing group of folks that we've enslaved, that we've taken from one place to another, forced to do the work that we won't or don't want to do, and then we've mistreated in ways that defy definition, and then suddenly, if they engage in practices, academics will refer to this as praxis, that frees